Chapter 7 of Brown Book of the Hitler Terror. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Brown Book of the Hitler Terror by Lord Marley. Chapter 7. Brutality and Torture. Part 1. The National Socialist German Labour Party, which for years has been maintained by the German Kaisers of Industry and Agriculture, has studied history to guide it in playing its part in the period of social decline. It learnt arson from Nero, the persecution of the Jews from the Middle Ages, the murder of socialists from Mussolini. For many years, the official documents of the National Socialist Party have been proclaiming the coming of a St. Bartholomew's Night. The official description has been the Night of the Long Knife. This night began with the burning of the Reichstag, and it is not yet over. The workers and peasants have shown too much resistance. Too many millions have rallied behind the banner of freedom. The National Socialist Labour Party has had to turn the St. Bartholomew's Night into a St. Bartholomew's Year, and it is the first quarter of this year which is covered in the following report. The friends of the Hitler government are always ready to repeat the government's declaration that peace and order reign in Germany. Dementists are issued to calm feeling outside of Germany, and festivals and parades are staged to distract attention from what is actually taking place. The few foreign tourists who still care to visit Germany under the present tyranny are not taken into storm troop barracks or into concentration camps. It is only by chance that the foreign visitor may be an eyewitness of the nightly tortures, shootings while trying to escape, and secretly organized murders. Every message from foreign journalists to their newspapers, every telephone conversation, every visit they make is carefully noted, and they are threatened with immediate expulsion. And when the cries of tortured victims in the cellars of storm troop barracks reach the ears of neighbors, when the wife of some tortured prisoner speaks out, when the brutality of the Nazis is actually seen by hundreds of witnesses, then the official explanation is given that this is an exceptional case. But in Essen, on March 7, 1933, Minister Goering officially proclaimed, to the applauding howls of a great mass meeting, that when wood is being planed, there are always shavings. In reply, it must be stated that these shavings have been organized for many years, that the methods of the Middle Ages now employed by the Nazis have been worked out and advocated for years by the National Socialist leaders. It is the National Socialist leaders who have organized the pogroms and lynchings, the burnings and the pillories, the tortures of the first, second, and third degrees. The methods of the Middle Ages have been employed publicly insofar as they were effective for propaganda. But the tortures have been carried out in private, in the darkness of the night. Even now, millions of Germans are ignorant of them. The terror by night. The secret terror has raged continuously since February 27, 1933. There is a general settlement of accounts. Arrests are made systematically, tortures carefully arranged. And the ministerial reply to scruples about torturing is to lay down how far these tortures can go. So long as I do not see any communists running around with their ears and noses cut off, there is no reason to get excited. Tortures up to this point are therefore authorized. There is no need to examine the victims too closely or to investigate the denunciations. The Nazis in their arrests can follow the instructions of the French cardinal who told the faithful of the original St. Bartholomew's Night, "Kill them all. God will be able to pick out his Christians." Every day we are being visited by new victims of these tortures by night, who show us their still open wounds. We print below declarations made on oath and reports which we have investigated with the utmost care. The torture chambers. One report makes it clear that the Nazis have established a regular tariff for beating prisoners. Simple membership of the Social Democratic Party is punished with 30 blows with a rubber truncheon on the naked body. Membership of the Communist Party is usually punished with 40 blows. The penalty is increased when the prisoner has been an official of a political party or trade union. The punishment is to be modified in accordance with the conduct of the prisoner. One prisoner, Bernstein, was given 50 lashes because he was a communist, and then a further 50 lashes because he was also a Jew. There are therefore several degrees of torture, a fact which is brought out in the various declarations which are in our possession. The torture begins from the moment when the victim is fetched from his home. The person who opens the door is threatened with revolvers, the members of the family are threatened, furniture and books are destroyed or thrown out into the street, authors' manuscripts, the fruit of many months of work, are destroyed. In the case of workers, whatever remains of their wages is confiscated. The family is made to witness the proceedings. The children see their father struck in his face by unknown young men. The wife sees her husband's face streaming with blood. She asks what they are going to do with him. She gets only an insult in reply. Then the prisoner is kicked out of the room and down the steps to the car which is waiting for him. One report states that after an arrest has been made, the Nazis begin to beat their prisoner on the way down the stairs. The leader of the storm troop suddenly ordered them to stop beating the prisoner, who then saw that people in the house opposite had been roused. The storm troopers are disciplined in public. But from the moment when the prisoner enters the Nazi barracks, he is as much an outlaw as the Nazi leaders have been threatening for years to make him. Any Nazi who meets the prisoner on the stairs or in the passages kicks or strikes him. Cowards have become murderers. Day after day they wait outside the doors of the rooms where the first degree of torture is applied, and make the prisoners run the gauntlet of whips and boots and rubber truncheons. Then the prisoner is admitted to the presence of the storm troop leader or higher officer, and the trial begins. The court. The judge sits behind a table. 3 stars on his storm troop uniform give him judicial powers over all prisoners. Daggers and bayonets are stuck into the table, and there are flickering candles at each end. The prisoner is pushed forward to the table. Nazis press closely round him. When he answers, they hit him. If he declares his innocence, they kick him. Any attempt to defend himself is useless. There is no question of what the truth is. The trial is only a farce to provide a pretext for making another martyr. The prisoner hears the source of the denunciation which was the cause of his arrest, and thinks that he can at once disprove the charge. He begins to say something, and then blows are rained down upon him, and he is told not to speak unless he is asked a question. They ask him for addresses. They think that they will be able to make capital of the story, that the leaders of the workers' movement have betrayed each other. But the prisoner refuses to say anything. Then the rubber truncheons are used again with furious rage. It is to the eternal honor of the German working class movement that thousands of workers have not flinched in spite of all the brutality and torture inflicted on them. They have refused to give new victims to their torturers. The cellars. From the court, the prisoners are taken to the cellars, where they can see in the semi-darkness the flogging benches standing ready. The air is thick with the smell of dried blood and sweat. The prisoner is thrown on to the flogging bench, and steel rods hammer down on his back. 4 of the Nazis do the beating. Each new blow cuts the raw flesh to pieces. Then they get tired and push him into the next cellar, where he is no longer alone. Fellow victims are cowering in the corners. The worst mutilated victims are writhing on straw sacks on the ground. Some have lost control and are crying out. From the next room come the cries of the next victim. The prisoners in the adjoining room can now see everything, as someone has thought it right to leave the doors open. The next victim starts up at the first blow from the steel rods. His face is pale. A new command makes him bow down again. His movement was criminal, and the punishment was made more severe. He was forced to count the blows in a loud voice, till the numbers could no longer be distinguished from his cries of pain. The half-unconscious prisoner is then pulled from the flogging bench, and the storm troop leader walks forward and announces to the victim, "Now you will be shot." The prisoner is placed with his face to the wall. There is silence, broken only by the Nazis releasing the safety catches of their revolvers. Then shots. The prisoner hears the whiz of bullets past his ears, and begins to realize that they are not hitting him. At last he sinks in a swoon, and before he loses consciousness he hears the Nazis laughing. We have many reports of similar treatment, and give the following as typical. I live in the Judenstrasse near number 50, where a storm troop detachment was quartered. On March 19th, the arbitrary arrests I previously reported were resumed. About 9 p.m., shortly after another prisoner had been taken in, the neighbors heard a shot through the open window of the Nazi office. I was determined to see what was happening, and discovered that there was a man, presumably the prisoner, standing doubled up against the window. Then more shots rang out, but the bullets did not hit the man. Then I saw him fall to the ground, and Nazis bent down over him, laughing. One voice shouted several times, "Now then, get up, go home." The prisoner seemed not to hear this shout, and he fainted with fear. Is it strange that one should hear of men being driven mad by this? Hundreds of prisoners have been through this. They have been dragged from the torture chambers and thrown into the waiting room among their comrades. At the last moment, before they sink down exhausted on their straw sacks, they are told that they are to be shot the following morning. They are in such pain that they are indifferent to the new threat. But when they come to themselves some time afterwards, they begin to think about it. They have no reason to doubt that the threat will be carried out, so they sit there among their groaning friends, waiting for their last morning to come. During the night, the guard leans against the door and sings, "Dawn, dawn, you light my way to early death." A report from the Hedemannstrasse barracks in Berlin gives this detail. Sworn declarations repeatedly show that in many cases the prisoners have been left for days with this threat hanging over them. They hear the beatings beginning again in the adjoining room. The doors are kicked open so that they can see the tortures. From time to time, one of the victims is called out and tried again. The Nazis delight in filth. A new prisoner, who looks like an intellectual, is pushed into the torture chamber. The Nazis hold his head, force his teeth apart, and then pour a bottle of castor oil down his throat. Then they ask him politely to take down his trousers. He unbuttons his braces and his trousers drop. The Nazis do not put him on the flogging bench. They make him stand doubled up. The Nazis wait a quarter of an hour. Then they pick up the steel rods and begin to beat him. He screams and stands upright. The Nazis press him down and beat him again. Then suddenly his bowels empty. The Nazi leaders will deny these loathsome cruelties, but our archives show that these statements are true, and we have not only the declarations made by intellectuals and workers who have experienced this, but there is also in our possession a report of a confidential meeting of Nazis in Berlin at which Dr. Goebbels, the Minister for Enlightenment, explained how he would deal with editors who happened to have different opinions from his. The protective corpsmen must go to the offices of the paper concerned and give each member of the editorial staff a liter of castor oil. The Nazis, therefore, only act in accordance with instructions. The Red Cross in Nazi cellars. The Nazi doctors, as a rule, are only present at the actual torturing. They are not to render any medical aid, but only to determine whether the prisoner may still be beaten. They are like the doctors of the Inquisition. The torture is stopped when there is danger of the victim dying. All reports show that medical aid is only given when the victim appears to be dying. Injections are only made at the last minute. The victims are only carried away to the hospital when the medical expert certifies that they are dying. Propaganda to justify the terror. For years, the National Socialist leaders had been preparing the ground for the terror by systematic propaganda. This was directed in the first place against the November criminals, the revolutionaries of November 1918, who were represented as having been responsible for all the sufferings of Germany since 1918. Intensive propaganda was also directed against the Soviet Union. In My Fight, Hitler wrote, "It must never be forgotten that the rulers of present-day Russia are blood-stained common criminals, the scum of humanity." And on March 10th, 1933, German wireless stations broadcast a Horst-Wessel play, in which Hitler's lies about the Soviet Union were repeated, that since 1917 2 million people had been murdered in Russia, that the Soviets are the embodiment of lies and deceit, looting and robbery. Then there was the systematic propaganda against the hereditary foe, France. Hatred of France was carefully nurtured, and the idea of revenge developed. The propaganda against the Jews is dealt with in another chapter. One example shows its effect in the brutalities shown to Jewish victims of the terror. A doctor was beaten up in Nazi barracks and was lying seriously injured and covered with blood on the straw. Someone who came into the room called attention to how serious the doctor's condition was. This made the Nazi guard furious with indignation, and from his excited statements it was possible to gather that his section leader had told the men the following legend: "All doctors who are Jews have for years been taking revenge on German women who come under their care in hospitals by secretly cutting out their ovaries, so that only Jewish women could bear children, and thus the Jews would rule Germany." The Nazi guard followed up this story by kicking the severely injured man in the stomach. The blood guilt of the Nazi leaders. The responsibility of the Nazi leaders not only for the methods of their organized gangs, but for the murderous feelings among their followers is made clear from statements made by the leaders both before and after their seizure of power. The present Minister of the Interior, Frick, declared that it is not a bad thing if a few tens of thousands of Marxist functionaries come to harm. Stohr, the former vice president of the Reichstag, told a mass meeting, "We will make the hemp industry prosper." Immediately after the new cabinet of Oldenburg was formed, the premier, Rover, announced, "We will put the Marxists and the people of the center on the gallows to feed the ravens." On March 10th, 1933, Minister Göring spoke at a mass meeting in Essen. "I would rather shoot a few times too short and too wide, but at any rate I would shoot." Göring's words fell on fruitful soil. At the end of April, the police president of Dortmund issued an instruction. "In the last few days many communist leaflets have been distributed. I order the police to make immediate use of their weapons against any attempt to distribute communist leaflets." The terror was organized. 1. On the night of the burning of the Reichstag, 30 Nazi barracks were prepared for carrying out tortures in Berlin alone. Steel rods, whips, chains, cords for tying up prisoners, water pails, and castor oil were bought and taken to the barracks. The same night they were used. Doctors were allocated to each barracks. 2. We are in possession of reports from a number of German towns showing that on the same evening the Nazis were fully mobilized, and guards were put round houses where working-class leaders lived, as well as at railway stations and post offices. 3. A similar selection of victims was made in all towns. 4. The arrests were almost everywhere left to the storm troops and their special detachments. The police merely accompanied them, as the Nazis were not at that time quite sure of their attitude. 5. The enrollment of stormtroopers as auxiliary police began on February 22nd. This is a definite indication that action on a large scale was contemplated, and that it was proposed to keep the appearance of legality as long as possible. 6. In his capacity as Commissioner for Prussia, Goering, officially by an order issued on February 17th, authorized shooting without any form of trial. Every man who in pursuance of this duty makes use of his weapons will be protected by me regardless of the consequence of his action. On the other hand, every man who from any false scruples does not use his weapons can anticipate criminal proceedings against himself. Every officer must at all times remember that omission to take the necessary measures is more serious than a mistake made in applying such measures. 7. High officials of the National Socialist Party have constantly been present in the torture cellars of the Hedemannstrasse in Berlin and in other barracks. They directed the acts of brutality and conducted trials. We have definite evidence, for example, that Count Helldorf, leader of the Nazi storm troops, who was and remains in daily communication with Goering and Hitler, held parades of the victims of the brutalities. Our documents. We have in our archives 536 declarations made by persons who had been severely ill-treated. The statements have been checked and found to be correct. 137 certificates show that the victims have received serious permanent injuries. 375 declarations mention that the victims, before being allowed to leave the torture houses, were forced to sign statements that they had been well treated. Our material from the towns and villages of the Third Empire supports the conclusion that since February 27th, about 60,000 people have been subjected to violence. An unemployed worker. On Monday, March 6th, 5 p.m., 2 stormtroopers and a leader came to the door of the flat occupied by the Reichstag deputy X and demanded admittance. I was in the flat sorting out the washing. I opened the door, at first on the chain. A revolver was thrust through the opening, and I was ordered to open the door immediately. I was asked where X was living, but could give no information. Then they took me off with them. They took me in a sidecar to the Botcherstrasse. There they began to ill-use me. I still have, at the time of writing this, the marks of what they did to me. Both eyes beaten blue, a bite on my left temple, my hands still swollen and scratched. They called me a young murderer, and similar names, without the slightest ground. Then they made me wash off the blood, which was streaming from my forehead, mouth, and nose. I had hardly washed it off when I was taken into the front room, and again they started beating me. I covered my face with my hands, or they would certainly have broken my jaws. But that did not satisfy them. Together with 2 other prisoners, I was taken in a taxi to the Hedemannstrasse with 2 motorcyclists as escort. I was told I should be thankful that they were so humane, as they worked differently in the lower groups. I nearly had to laugh when they told me this. At the Hedemannstrasse I stated, when they examined me, that I had been begging and had always got something at the door where X lived. Because of this I had gone there many times, also to talk politics, and eventually Frau X gave me some housework to do, beating carpets and so on. I told the Nazis that I had been very glad to get such treatment from communists. I told them that I was a communist sympathizer and had voted for List 3. Then the man in charge said, "We can always do with people who tell the truth. It is not you we want. It is your leaders we want to destroy and settle accounts with. But workers are brutally beaten. On the evening of March 5th, I was with 6 other workers in a public house in Berlin North. We were waiting to hear the election results. A group of uniformed stormtroop men came in, pointed their revolvers at us, and made us go with them, with our hands above our heads, to the stormtroop quarters in the X-Strasse. There we were beaten up as communist sows. Then we were put into a car and taken to the Nazi headquarters in Hedemannstrasse. We were chased up to the 4th floor and driven along a corridor with repeated blows and lashes with riding whips. The corridor was decorated from top to bottom with conquered social democratic banners and posters. There was a figure against the wall which was supposed to represent Ernst Thälmann in the uniform of the Red Front, hanging on gallows. We were driven with blows into a general room. We were forced to go down on our knees and shout Heil Hitler, also to say the Our Father and sing the Horst Wessel song. Anyone who did not obey instantaneously was beaten till he was unconscious. Later we were placed against the wall of the room and continuous volleys were fired close above our heads. After they had left us alone for a little while, we were put through the first interrogation. Each of us was summoned alone into a room where there were about 6 Nazis with riding whips. We had to strip and were then told that we should be beaten until we told everything. They demanded that we should confess the most impossible things. We were asked to give the names and addresses of communist officials and to reveal imaginary hiding places of arms and duplicating machines. During the interrogation, we were beaten the whole time. Then we were given half an hour to think things over, and then the torture began again. Some anti-fascists who had formerly belonged to the Nazis had their heads shaved, except for a forelock, which was tied together. We were told that these people were to be shot next morning. When we arrived, they were lying unconscious on the floor of the general room. Besides ourselves, there were about 50 other communist and social democrat workers in the room. When we were released, a document was put in front of us stating that we had left the building without any injury to our health. We signed. I found 2 of those who had been with me some time after in the Am Friedrichshain hospital. One of them had a bullet wound in the neck. Other typical cases. J.M., a worker living in the Wederstrasse, Berlin, was taken away by stormtroop men during the night of March 27th to 28th and severely ill-treated in the Nazi barracks in the Roteverstrasse. His whole body is covered with open wounds. R., a worker living in Schönberg, who was known to do political work, was found in his flat and there severely injured with steel rods, then being taken to a Nazi barracks. At the time when this report was being written, it was not yet known what had become of him. His flat was completely smashed up by the Nazis when they came to arrest him. Max F., a worker in West Brandenburg, was attacked during the night by about 40 armed stormtroop men. The door of his flat was broken in and they started shooting wildly into the flat. He was hit in the back, but managed to jump through a window and escape. As he ran, he was hit again in the arm, and another shot grazed his body. He got away and was taken in by a hospital. It had to be kept secret that he was in the hospital. Every day his relatives were threatened. Paul Paprocki, a worker of 36 years of age, living in number 23 Malplakstrasse, was taken from his room at 3 a.m. on the night of March 26th to 27th. A strong detachment of stormtroop men took him to their headquarters in the Utrechtstrasse. When he refused to give any addresses, they began to ill-use him. Some hours later, he was released with serious injuries from blows. The 18-year-old worker Kurt Hackenbusch, Grundthalerstrasse 63, was arrested with 3 of his friends on March 26th and taken to the Nazi quarters in the Prinzenstrasse. There they were beaten with heavy leather straps. The prisoners refused to say Our Father. Further beating. Some hours later, the prisoners were taken to an accident station, where they were forced by threats to state that the Nazis had rescued them from an attack. In addition to cuts in his face and back, Hackenbusch has a severe wound on his head. Jacob Ickler, a worker living in Kassel, Kettengasse 4, 20 years old, was carried off on March 20th, 1933 by Nazis who searched his father's flat. He was taken to the town hall, laid on a flogging bench, and then beaten with rubber truncheons. Some blows struck the lower half of his face and his temples. His back and upper legs were streaming with blood. A doctor's certificate testifies to the condition in which he was found. The doctor's name is not given here, as in Germany of the Third Empire it is no longer safe to give medical attention to a man who has been injured. Urine for thirst. Wilhelm Sollmann, a social democratic member of the Reichstag and a former minister of the Reich, writes as under of his ill usage at the hands of stormtroop and protective corpsmen, "On Thursday, March 9th, shortly after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 3 cars filled with stormtroop and protective corpsmen pulled up at my house. As at the moment I was speaking on the telephone to a member of the town council, I was able to tell him, 'Nazis are forcing their way in. Give the mobile police the alarm.' At that moment a number of men armed with loaded revolvers, sticks, and knives forced their way into my study. Before I could say a word, I was struck down at my desk. The men were in a kind of frenzy of hate and joy at being able to take revenge on me. Most of the men went to the other rooms in the house and in a few minutes literally smashed everything to splinters. I was hit and thrown into an open car. My wife called out, 'Where are you taking my husband?' One of them answered jeeringly, 'You will soon know that.' First they drove me over the grass towards the wood, as there was a stormtroop man sitting in front of me and flourishing a revolver the whole time. I thought that they were going to shoot me in the nearest wood, but they drove on, abusing me all the time. Some of the abuse was quite insane, and then we crossed the bridge near Kalk. There they drove slowly, and all along the high street, which was full of people, I was exhibited to the crowd. 'This is the great Sollmann. See how small he is.' I was taken to the district headquarters of the National Socialists in the Mozartstrasse. I was chased up the stairs with blows and kicks and lashes, and then into the conference room. They had lowered the blinds so that the room was half in darkness. I was to be put before the tribunal. A large swastika banner was spread over the table. I saw that my colleague, Efferoth, was sitting near the window, in the same plight as myself. I had hardly taken a seat near him when the tortures began, and they went on for 2 hours. First, a man in stormtroop uniform, whom my colleague said was Chancellor Abele, made a short speech attacking Efferoth, saying that retribution was now to come. Then protective corpsmen began attacking us with their fists. For about half an hour Efferoth and I lay on the floor, so exhausted that we could not get up. All the time we were being hit and kicked, and now and then our hair was pulled and our heads knocked together. Eventually we were pulled up and forced into chairs. A man held our hands behind the chair, while another forced us to open our teeth, and poured a quarter of a liter of castor oil down our throats. One of our tormentors shouted for salts to increase our torture, but apparently salts could not be got quickly enough. Then they gave us a short rest again. I begged for a glass of water. When it was given to me, I saw its color and therefore only used it to pour over my hands, which were covered with blood. One of the men shouted, "Why don't you drink the water?" At the same moment he threw the glass with what was left of its contents into my face. Then we were struck and kicked again. All at once our tormentors seemed to get uneasy. I thought that the police must have been notified of our being attacked and carried off. About 5 o'clock the protective corpsmen took hold of us and with a shout of "Into the coal cellar!" literally flung us down the stairs. Apparently the coal cellar was locked, and they seemed to be in a hurry to get rid of us. They therefore pushed us across the street with blows and kicks, our faces were already a bloody pulp, to a motor, where we were made to squat on the floor. The ill treatment was carried on in the closed motor. One blow struck me in the right eye. We pulled up at police headquarters. Although we were in a state of collapse, we were forced to run in and up the stairs. One of the Nazis said that next day we would have to walk in front of the Nazis' torchlight procession, and at the finish we would be thrown on the heap of torches. The president of the police advised us to let ourselves be put under protective arrest. I referred to my parliamentary immunity. He agreed with what I had said, but nevertheless advised that Efferoth and I should go into the prison hospital. In the hospital we were sewn up and bandaged. During the torturing, one of the protective corpsmen had slowly and deliberately pressed a knife into Efferoth's side. The doctor stated that it would have been dangerous if it had gone a centimeter deeper. Next day the press published a report that we had been attacked by political opponents and suffered slight injuries. End of Chapter 7, Part 1. Chapter 7 of Brown Book of the Hitler Terror. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Brown Book of the Hitler Terror by Lord Marley. Chapter 7. Brutality and Torture, Part 2. A doctor and his wife tortured. On June 3rd, at 4 a.m, there was a ring at the door of the flat. A number of men shouted, "Police, open the door." My wife replied, "Please come in the morning. I don't open the door at night." Then there were heavy blows against the door. It was broken in, and 5 men in storm-troop uniform, without police badges, forced their way into the flat, holding revolvers out at us. I asked what they wanted, and they replied with a shower of blows with their fists and rubber truncheons. "Hold your mouth. Who asked you to speak?" They ordered, "Hands up." Some of them seized my throat and pressed me against the wall. "It's all up with you Jews, you Bolshevik rabble." When I tried to say something, they struck me again. They searched the flat, smashed in the drawers of my desk, filled a trunk with books, manuscripts, and letters, and ordered me to get out of it. My wife, who did not want to leave me in the hands of these bandits, came with me, although she was told not to. They kicked me down the steps. When my wife protested against their treating a sick man like that, she was cursed and pushed off the seat of the car. "You impudent sow, keep quiet or you'll get it too." The car pulled up at a house, in front of which there was a group of storm-troop and protective corpsmen. As soon as we got out of the car, we were driven along with rubber truncheons and dog whips, and up the stairs to the 4th floor. I was hardly able to climb up, as I had influenza and my heart was weak, so they beat me furiously until I reached the top. I was pushed into a corridor, and my wife and I were made to run the gauntlet through Nazis, who struck at us as we passed. I was then taken to a separate room. I stated that there must be some mistake, and asked to be allowed to clear it up. The prisoner, who had worked at a Berlin hospital for 7 years, and had since been chief doctor in a section of the municipal hospital in Neukölln, learnt in the course of a long interrogation that the absurd charge was made against him that he was the head of the communist propaganda activities in the Reich. When he protested his innocence, he was beaten. He continues his report. "They threw themselves on me with bestial fury, using rubber truncheons, leather whips, and steel rods. They hit particularly at my head, jumping up on tables and chairs and hitting mercilessly at me from above my head. My face was streaming with blood. My cries for help soon stopped. A few blows with an iron rod, and I doubled up and fell unconscious." The victim further reports that he was soon in a condition in which he might die at any moment, and the Nazis felt compelled to summon medical aid. He was able, however, to keep track of what was happening, and his account includes the following. There were young men sitting in the room. Their faces were pale, and many had bandages around their heads. They were waiting to be interrogated. Now and then Nazis would come into the room and insist on all the prisoners jumping up and greeting them with "Heil Hitler." Those who did not obey the order promptly enough were lashed with whips and forced to stand up and sit down again. They had to do this 10 or more times in quick succession. Stormtroop men came in and took revolvers and ammunition from the drawers of the desk. The drawers were full of revolvers, and each Nazi selected the one he liked best. Other Nazis came in looking for the list of volunteers for Austria. A man who had sworn at a stormtroop man some days before was pulled out of his bed that night and arrested. A woman who had said that a man who had gone over from the communists to the Nazis was mad was arrested at her flat and brought to the Nazi headquarters. All at once, someone shouted, "Peek und Olstein have been arrested and will be brought here." The stormtroop men raved with delight and swung their rubber truncheons round them. Let them come. Someone said that the worker Schulze had come. All the Nazis went out of the room. For a quarter of an hour I heard them raging out in the corridor. Then a short man about 30 years of age was pushed into the room. His right eye was full of blood. In the interrogation he admitted that he was a member of the Red Aid. He was accused of having been present when a stormtroop man was murdered. He denied this. He said that he had already been arrested on suspicion of this charge and then set free again. He was beaten with dog whips and ordered to answer yes to every question put to him. He was beaten until he answered yes. "Are you a murderer, you scoundrel?" He answered no. He was then beaten harder. His whole face was covered with blood. He wiped his face with his sleeve. "You've admitted it now." He replied, "It was you who compelled me to say it." They beat him again. He was asked how many children he had brought into the world, and with how many women he had slept, and whether all his children were such idiots as he was. Then he was sent into the kitchen to have his head shaved. When he came back, he was pushed in front of a fragile old man, a clergyman from Lichterfelde. The white-haired old gentleman was told to hold out his hand to him and say, "Good day, comrade." The old man held out his hand and said, "I shake your hand. You are a suffering human being." They all laughed. "That's how you greet a murderer?" The old man answered, "And even if he is a man who has been tortured, and you are the embodiment of force, and force is not eternal. You cannot break my convictions with rubber truncheons. You are national, and I am international." This courageous act of the white-haired old man made some of the Nazis look abashed, and when some of them rushed at him, the others held them back. After midnight I was taken to the interrogation room, where I saw my wife, who was as pale as a ghost. She whispered to me, "I can't bear it any longer. I must throw myself out the window. They are going to say that you are a spy of the Cheka and shoot you. Don't do anything stupid. Pull yourself together." This exchange of words was enough to rouse the Nazi in charge to fury. He was so tired, or drunk, that he could hardly sit up. My wife was led away. My condition grew worse, and I asked for a doctor. I was taken to the room of the officer in charge, and my wife was allowed to give me something to drink. In spite of the victim's critical condition, the stormtroop detachment was determined to force the doctor to confess. The man pulled out his revolver and yelled, "3 bullets, 1 in your forehead, 1 in your mouth, 1 in your stomach, and then it's all over and you'll be thrown on the dung heap." I lay silent and quite still. He raised his fist and struck me in the face. "In a couple of minutes it will be all over with you. I'll hang you from the window. I've hanged people in Kiev like that. Only a few minutes more. When I leave the room it will be too late. Whether you say it or not, you miserable scoundrel. What is the Cheka doing? What is the Ogpu doing? Are you going to talk or not?" I lay still, and he kicked me in the stomach as hard as he could. I lost consciousness. A doctor decoyed into a trap. Although every victim of the Nazis deserves equal mention, we must quote the case of another doctor on account of its special features. The following report is taken from the Saarbrück Arbeiterstimme. On March 17th there was a regular meeting of the Berlin Medical Association. After the lecture, the chairman, Professor Goldscheider, head of the university clinic, A man 70 years of age asked his colleagues to remain for a few minutes, as he wanted to show them a particularly interesting case. Then a patient completely swathed in bandages was brought in, and Professor Goldscheider explained, "Gentlemen, this patient is our colleague Dr. Lust. The day before yesterday he received a telephone call in the evening summoning him to a patient in Lichterfelde. When he reached there he was met by storm-troop men and ill-treated in this terrible way." These words caused great indignation at the meeting. The well-known Professor Sauerbruch, a German nationalist, jumped up and declared that he was prepared to take the victim of the Nazis into his clinic. As a result of this experience, something like a panic had spread through Berlin doctors, many of whom fear that when they are called to a patient, they may meet a similar terrible fate. A woman, 46 years old, whipped. During the night of Monday, March 20th, Tuesday, March 21st, the Social Democratic woman counselor Maria Jankowski was attacked in her flat, Bergmannstrasse 18, Köpenick, Berlin. A laundry van pulled up in front of the house. 20 storm-troop men broke in the house door and occupied the stairs. 6 men forced their way into her flat with revolvers ready. Frau Jankowski was taken in the van with 2 communist officials who were already in it to the transport headquarters of the Nazis in Köpenick. In a shed in the courtyard, she was forced to take off her clothes and lie on a wooden bench, which was covered with a black-red-gold flag. 4 men held her down, one pressing her face into a bundle of old rags. For 2 hours this woman, 46 years old, was beaten mercilessly with truncheons, steel rods, and whips. After this torture, Frau Jankowski was put into the street. At about 5 in the morning, some passers-by found her and took her home in a taxi. The doctor certified that her condition was dangerous. 1 kidney had been broken by blows. There was literally not a sound spot left on her body. In the Antonius Hospital in Karlhorst, Frau Jankowski made the following deposition. "While I was being beaten, I was told again and again to give the names and addresses of workers. They made me count the colors of the Republic and say foul words instead of black, red, gold. They asked me questions like, 'Have you had any money from the welfare department? Have you housed and fed communists? Have you stolen shoes from unemployed workers? Have you made a list of Nazi shops to be boycotted?' Every time I answered no, I was given a new shower of blows. When I cried out, the 5th of my tormentors pressed my face into the rags. After I had had at least 100 blows, I fell off the bench. I was then pulled off the ground and given such a blow in my face that I fell in a corner, damaging my knee. Then, together with the 2 communist workers who were also being tortured, I was forced to sing Deutschland, Deutschland über alles. I was compelled to sign a declaration that I would leave the Social Democratic Party, that I would never take part in politics again, and that I would report every Thursday to the Nazi office. Then I was given different treatment. I was given a glass of water. My clothes were brushed and given back to me. The leader told one of the men to take the lady out. The man held me up when I was about to fall down and shut the door after me with a polite 'good evening.' My husband reported the facts to the police, but was told that they were powerless." What was it that made these young lads carry out the inhuman cruelties recorded above? This hate was directed against a woman who for years had been in a responsible position, giving relief where it was needed, a woman old enough to be their mother. There is no question of this having been a private act of revenge. The lads not only made the woman strip and beat her, they also demanded names and addresses of Social Democratic Party members. They were acting on instructions from Nazi leaders. The leaders not only hushed up this crime, but when it had become known abroad, started proceedings against her for spreading atrocity stories. Nerve specialist exiled after being beaten. On Tuesday, March 21st, the nerve specialist Dr. Frankel, whose patients are mainly working-class people, was arrested in his flat in Berlin by a large detachment of storm-troop men. He was taken to the Nazi barracks in the General Papestrasse and kept there till Thursday. In these 2 days he was interrogated several times, and on each occasion beaten with steel rods and dog whips. The results of this ill treatment, including damage to an eye by a lash from a whip, were established beyond question when he was released. Dr. Frankl was released on March 23rd after he had signed an undertaking for himself and his wife that they would immediately leave Germany and never return. Dr. Frankl, who was now living abroad, reported as follows on some of the details of his treatment. While I was there, about 15 young workers were brought into the room where I had been put. I can testify that these young workers were most cruelly ill-treated. As a doctor, I am of the opinion that at least 8 of them must have succumbed to the injuries they received. After they had been tied up and lighted cigarettes had been pressed into the soles of their feet, the storm-troop men continued torturing them cruelly for hours. A Dr. Philippsthal of Biesdorf, Berlin, was brought in at the same time as I was. He was seriously wounded. I am very doubtful whether he got through alive. Editorial note: on March 23rd, Dr. Philippsthal was taken to the Urbank Hospital, where he did in fact die. Reichsbanner and Social Democrat officials. The dementis issued by the Nazi government always tried to represent the excesses in the Nazi barracks as the arbitrary acts of individuals. We print here a number of reports from Kassel, which make it perfectly clear how closely the brutal acts are connected with the Nazi leadership. The Nazis did not take much trouble to distinguish between trials and torturings, which took place in different rooms of the same house. A deposition made by Hans Quer, a Reichsbanner leader, contains the following. On March 24, 1933, at about 1 o'clock, I was arrested by 4 storm-troop men and 1 civilian and taken to the town hall. They said, "Herr Quer, you must come with us." And then I was taken along, 2 men holding my arms. I was taken down the outside steps. Several Nazis who were at the top calling out to the public, "Here comes the Reichsbanner General Quer." I was taken to the public hall. The storm-troop leader who took me is a commercial traveler selling gin. He was formerly employed in the welfare department. He stole some money and was dismissed and sentenced to 4 months' imprisonment. One of the storm-troop men then took my particulars, including what party I belonged to. Then I was informed that I could go. As I went out, 2 Nazis got hold of me and prevented me from going. One of them went in to the man who had taken my particulars. Soon after, he came back and waved his hand, indicating that I was to be taken down to the cellar. There I was met by 10 to 15 storm-troop men, who ordered me to take off my hat and coat. Then I was taken into a dark cellar, where there was a bench. One of the men went in front with an electric torch. The torch went out. I was forced down onto the bench, and for 10 or 15 minutes was beaten with rubber truncheons in a most brutal and inhuman way. When I fell off the bench half unconscious and begged them not to be so inhuman, they jeered at me and started beating me harder than ever. When I was coming out of the cellar, I did not walk quickly enough for them, and I was told, "You had too little. If you don't hurry up, you'll be brought back in again." Other cases in Kassel. Martin Meyer, aged 30, a municipal official of Botnerstrasse 4, was taken out of the municipal offices where he was working at 12:30 on March 24th by storm-troop men, and taken to the public hall in the Karlstrasse. There he was taken into a dark cellar, laid on a bench, and beaten with rubber truncheons for half an hour, with one short interval. One blow hit his nose, and another his right eye. Cashel Seppel, trade union secretary, Schillstrasse 14, Kassel, was taken from the trade union house, along with Goerke, another trade union secretary, by 8 storm-troop men on March 23, 1933 at 5 p.m. They were told they were to be tried at the public hall. They were put into a large hall. They heard cries coming from the rooms below. They waited an hour. They were then taken by 8 men into a dark cellar, laid across a table, and beaten by 6 men with rubber truncheons. They are now still confined to bed and under medical treatment. Their kidneys appear to be injured. Their urine is mixed with blood. Their backs, buttocks, and legs are injured. Ball Heinrich, a shopkeeper of Ludwigstrasse 2, Kassel, was arrested in his shop at about 3 p.m. on March 24, 1933, by 4 storm-troop men and taken to the public hall. He was beaten in the street and threatened that he would be shot if he tried to escape. Maltreated in the public hall, he was made to take down his trousers and beaten for a quarter of an hour with rubber truncheons. Since then, he has been in Kassel Hospital. Christian Wittrock, age 40, manager of the local health insurance department at Kassel, was taken out of his office by 2 storm-troop men on March 24, 1933. He was taken down the outside steps, then through a crowd of people to the public hall in the Karlstrasse. There he was asked particulars about himself, and then the Nazi in charge said, "Wittrock is discharged." He was then taken out as if he was going to be set free, but then taken into a dark cellar, laid on a bench there, and beaten with rubber truncheons. 2 blows on his head, his skin cut on his back, his buttocks, and his legs. His clothes were stained with blood and partly torn, also his shoes. Then he was taken back into the hall and there beaten again. He is now under medical treatment. Even an officer maltreated. In the second week of March, a retired Lieutenant Anhalt, now district surveyor, living at Germaniastrasse 12, Tempelhof, Berlin, was arrested in his flat by 3 storm-troop men and 1 civilian. He immediately gave the alarm to the police, who arrived at his flat, but refused to interfere. The storm-troop men took Anhalt to the Hedemannstrasse. There he was first struck by the civilian for having called the police. Then he was taken into a room where there were already 12 or 13 men lying on straw. A storm-troop man, whom they called Oberfahrer, took charge of the lieutenant. There was no mention of the fact that Anhalt was charged with anything. Oberfahrer only knew that he had a former officer in front of him. He began to deliver punishment with 2 accomplices, and did not stop beating Anhalt until blood was streaming from his mouth and nose. Then he lifted up the injured man and showed him to the other prisoners lying groaning on the floor, saying, "See here, this swine is a lieutenant, and in such a fright that he can't stand straight." As Anhalt then stood up, the storm-troop man then kicked him behind his knees, and repeated this till Anhalt fell down. Another beating followed, which, however, did not seem to break the prisoner's spirit to the desired extent. Anhalt endured the blows in silence, and the storm-troop man shouted in fury, "You'll howl, you dog," and hit at Anhalt until he lost consciousness. Then he threw him on the straw by the other prisoners. Otto Gerke arrived at the Trade Union House, Kassel, at 3:30. 3 auxiliary police said, Number 1, "That's one of them." Number 2, "We'll come for him." Number 3, "That's Gerke of the Metalworkers' Union." At 4:30, 4 storm-troop men entered the office. "Herr Gerke?" "Yes." "Put on your coat. You must come with us to be interrogated." In reply to my question whether the police president knew of this, I was told yes. 8 storm-troop men took me into the public hall. I was first taken to the guard room, then up into the hall and searched for arms. At about 5:30 I was summoned and taken by 2 storm-troop men down the steps into the cellar, where there were a number of bicycles in the passage. They told me to leave my hat and coat there. I was then taken down 12 steps into a lower cellar. In this cellar I was thrown onto a table. My head and arms were held down, and I was beaten with rubber truncheons for 15 to 20 minutes. I was then pulled up and told to say Heil Hitler, which I could not do. A doctor was summoned immediately, and he certified that I was suffering from loss of blood and nervous collapse. Kassel, March 28, 1933. I certify that I have treated Herr Otto Gerke, Josefstrasse Castle, for wounds on both arms, buttocks, legs, and calves. The wounds extend to the region of the kidneys. I have had Herr Gerke under treatment since March 24th. He is unable to carry out his duties and must be confined to bed. Signed. Propaganda film instead of dinner. At 6:30 a.m. on Monday, April 3rd, I was arrested by 2 protective corpsmen. Although my interrogation showed that there was no ground for my arrest, I was taken with 2 other prisoners to an ice cellar, an underground room 15 feet by 6 with no opening for either air or light. On Thursday at about 11:30 p.m. we were brought out of the cellar and put into a schoolroom. On Friday we thought that we were going to be released, but they had evidently only decided to make a spectacle of us. As we were put into a car, we were surrounded by a crowd of fascists who jeered at us. To our surprise, we were taken to a cinema where we were shown a film, Bleeding Germany. It was a film of incitement against France and included the shooting of Schlageter. One of the Nazis present began a speech. He imagined that he could win us over, but the main thing in our minds was that we had no dinner that day. At midnight on Friday, I was again fetched out by 2 stormtroop men and taken to the police station. I was not able to answer their questions to their satisfaction, and the police inspector ordered me to be taken out again. An hour later, 2 protective corpsmen came for me, but they did not take me back to where I had been imprisoned. They drove the car out to a wood and pulled up there. I was pulled out and then thrown to the ground. Then they asked me, "Where are the arms?" I said, "I don't know of any." Then they started to beat me with rubber truncheons. One man holding my face pressed into the sand. After a while they paused and again demanded, "Where are the arms?" I thought of trying to run, as I felt that nothing mattered anymore, but then I noticed that they were getting tired. The man who was holding down my head let go, and then I felt a terrible blow on my head and lost consciousness. When I came to, I crept home. Tagore's experience. In the last week of April, the nephew of the Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore was arrested on suspicion of having plotted to assassinate Hitler. He was afterwards released and gave the following account of his experiences. The room in which I was put was underground, dark and without any air. 22 prisoners were already imprisoned there, all of them members of left parties, mostly communists. Many of them had already been there more than a month and had not yet even been interrogated. From time to time one of them would be summoned and taken out of the cell. We would hear terrible cries, and then our companion would be pushed back into the room. He would show us the traces of what had been done to him. A communist member of the Reichstag showed me the marks of ill usage on his body, saying simply, "Look, this is called national German culture." On the day I was arrested, a young man of the name of Ram was called out and returned with cut and bleeding thighs. The stormtroop men had beaten him with steel rods because he had refused to give false evidence against his comrades. Early on Tuesday morning, a man was thrown into our cell who could hardly stand. His arm was swollen and in a sling, and his face was covered with blood. He was a trade union official of the name of Führer. Stormtroop men had forced their way into the trade union house, and as Führer could not produce the arms which they demanded he should give up, they attacked him, broke his arm, pushed a stick into his side, ripped his cheek open nearly to his eye, knocked him down and kicked him. It was impossible to sleep at night. All the time the place was filled with the cries of the prisoners and the singing and laughter of our tormentors. In the next cell, one prisoner was crying out for his mother without cessation. Often the stormtroop men would come into the cells to carry out their brutalities. Documents which not even Goebbels can dispute. Kurt Haas, a film critic who took absolutely no part in politics, was arrested by civilians in his flat on the night of February 28th. He refused to go with the men, who produced no official document apart from stormtroop credentials. Then they threatened that they would shoot him, and they beat him on his bed, tied him up and carried him, severely injured, to a car. Some police stopped the car on the way and rescued Haas. His wounds were bandaged in hospital, and then he was released. Up to this point, there was nothing exceptional in this story, but Haas made a complaint to the Minister of the Interior, and what followed gives the case importance. Although the stormtroop men were quite unable to produce any proof that they were acting on behalf of the authorities, they were subsequently fully protected by the ministry. Here is the reply sent by Göring's ministry. Prussian Ministry of the Interior, Stormtroop Connections Department number 29-33, Berlin, 13 March 1933, to Herr Kurt Haas, Berlin, Wilmersdorf. Your letter, dated 4/3/1933, addressed to the Minister of the Interior, has been passed to me as the appropriate officer to investigate and decide the matter. I have ascertained that the particulars given in your letter are inaccurate and distorted in essential points. The storm troop was completely in the right and acted with authority to take you into protective arrest. In accordance with the information I have received, after the storm troop men had produced their credentials, as you yourself admit, they acted as the circumstances required. After putting on your clothes at their request, you yourself are responsible for having made it necessary to break your resistance by force, inasmuch as you suddenly began to shout and bluster, and attacked the storm troop members, biting one man's thumb so severely that the wound is not yet healed. From the facts in my possession, the degree of force used was not greater than was required to break your resistance. I see no grounds for taking any action against the storm troop leader and men concerned, but must rather reserve to the injured storm troop man the right to take proceedings against you. Head of the Storm Troop Connections Department in the Prussian Ministry of the Interior, signed Dr. Hale. This document should be of historical value. It can as little be disputed as the official announcement from Bielefeld. 3rd April 1933. The Social Democratic member of the Reichstag and Town Councillor Schreck was arrested yesterday. At present he is in hospital. End of Chapter 7.
Chapter 8 of Brown Book of the Hitler Terror. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Brown Book of the Hitler Terror by Lord Marley. Chapter 8. The Persecution of Jews. Part 1. One of the first acts of the new nationalist government of Thuringia was the dissolution of the Central Union of German citizens of Jewish faith within the territory of the Thuringian state. The following statement was issued by the government in explanation. Quote, "One of the chief objects of the Central Union is to fight anti-Semitism. As there is no anti-Semitism in Germany, the Central Union no longer has any justification for its existence. It is therefore dissolved as from today." End of quote. We are here dealing with questions of fact. Authentic reports and depositions relating to tortures, acts of brutality and outlawry directed against Jews living in Germany will show clearly enough where the boundary lies between atrocity stories and the appalling reality. It will become evident that although in some particular cases the so-called atrocity stories may have been inexact and exaggerated, yet they have also to some extent understated the actual facts of brutality. For example, there has been a report that a certain Herr Cohn had his hairs pulled out one by one. But it turned out that this Herr Cohn had been out of Germany for some time and had not suffered at all. But on the other hand, that a certain Herr Levy not only had his hair pulled out, but had one of his eyes put out and has been in a hospital for some weeks in danger of death. Mistakes in names and in places where incidents took place have come to light. But for every case reported which on investigation proved to be incorrect or exaggerated, there are 100 cases of torture, murder, and robbery which have not come to light at all, for the reason that the people concerned have been threatened with death if they tell the truth about the crimes which are being committed every day in Hitler's Germany. The reports of actual incidents can stand by themselves without any reference to the problem of the Jewish question. Many attempts, written from various standpoints, have been made to present an analysis of the situation in Germany in regard to the Jews. Here we deal with this wider question very briefly, but it is essential to say something of the inseparable connection which exists between the Hitler movement and anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism as one of the foundations of National Socialism. It is an old practice of the ruling class to distract the attention of the people from their actual sufferings. It is not possible here to deal in a scientific way with the reasons why attacks on the Jews have for many centuries served as the basis for distracting the people in this way, why throughout the Middle Ages the Jews were attacked as a religious community, and more recently, for the most part, as a race. The analysis made by Marx in the Jewish question has been followed by many subsequent writers who have treated the question from a social standpoint. At the present time, it is impossible to approach the Jewish question as a confused complex of race, nationality, people, and religion. It must be regarded as a social question containing racial, national, and religious elements. Anti-Semitism in modern Germany. Hitlerism is a characteristic form of the process of dissolution of the lower middle class in the age of industrial capitalism, and it has its parallel in the past. Anti-Semitism in modern Germany dates from the movement which developed under Adolf Hitler, a court chaplain, in the last quarter of last century. The basis of that movement was economic. There was a period of unrestricted speculation in the years when German industry was being built up after the victorious war of 1870–71, and this was followed by a severe economic crisis, which directly affected the lower middle class as well as the working class. Adolf Hitler found the new gospel of salvation in a campaign against the Jews. Ernst Ottwalt, in his brilliant study Germany Awake, writes of Hitler as follows, quote, "Without any regard to fundamental economic facts, Hitler ascribed to Jewish influence everything within the German Empire which seemed to him unhealthy and harmful. In the indebtedness of the peasant population of the provinces of East Prussia, which was an inevitable consequence of the increasing world production of grain, Hitler could see only the Jew who gave credit to the peasant, in order to drive him from hearth and home a short time afterwards, out of diabolical wickedness. He saw in the wretched position of the German industrial workers, not the greed of a type of capitalist which had been brought into being by the advance made in the means of production, but the existence of Jewish capitalists, and the Jews were responsible for everything." End of quote. Bismarck, the servant of the Jews. The anti-Semite propaganda achieved a certain success. The first revolutionary upheaval of the duped lower middle class was concentrated on the weakest point, that is to say, the Jewish minority. But when Adolf Hitler began to attack the rich and powerful Jews also, the solidarity of the possessing class was roused. Bismarck himself intervened, and the court chaplain who had become an agitator fell out of favor. It is amusing to find that the anti-Semitic movement of that period also attacked Bismarck, denouncing him as the servant of the Jews. A pamphlet published in 1878 contains the following, quote, "The credit for having raised the Jews and their associates into a ruling clique in Germany must be given to Prince Bismarck. The protection of the Jews is one of the blackest pages in Bismarck's glorious empire, with its consequences in the impoverishment of the working class, the demoralization of all sections of society, and the disgusting fusion of money with the aristocracy by birth. Prince Bismarck succumbed to the influence of the Jews. The society in which he moved was composed of Jews and the associates of Jews. They were always with him, and were his political advisers and the champions of civilization on whom he mainly relied." End of quote. This popular movement of the time inevitably found expression in excesses. The signal was given by the burning down of the synagogue in the little Pomeranian town of Neustetten. Then, too, the national indignation was roused by an act of incendiarism, and then, too, it was not the incendiaries who were brought to trial, but Jews, who were alleged to have burnt down their own temple out of vindictiveness. Pogroms followed, and when the popular movement had already begun to flag, when the economic crisis was over, this anti-Semitism took legal shape in the form of parties, and also found people who could supply the necessary ideology. Professor Eugen Düring, with his work on the Jewish question as a question of racial character, opened a new era of anti-Semitism, racial anti-Semitism. Since then, a great deal of ink has flowed in order to prove that the Jews are a race, and an outlandish, inferior, and criminal race at that. Apart from Chamberlain's ingenious assertions, this "science" has for the most part been content with coarse jests. Now, in Hitler's Germany, the science celebrates its triumph, and no doubt there are a good many people who will be able to earn their bread in this shameful way in the Third Empire. Anti-Semitic parties. Germany was the country in which anti-Semitism was first organized on a party basis. These parties were the German Social Party, the Anti-Semite People's Party, and later the German Reform Party. They had no other object than anti-Semitism, which was the sole aim and purpose of their existence. It was characteristic that their fortunes varied with the economic situation. But in any case, anti-Semitism remained parliamentary for nearly 3 decades. During this period it was a sociological rather than a social phenomenon. With the economic catastrophe of the post-war period, however, anti-Semite parliamentarism once more developed into a popular movement. The traditional anti-Semitic parties disappeared, but there were no fewer than 260 anti-Semitic organizations in post-war Germany. These were all united by the National Socialists. The National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany is indissolubly linked with anti-Semitism. In fact, it is quite unthinkable without it. Anti-Semitism was one of the foundations and the constant companion of National Socialism from triumph to triumph up to the seizure of power. Forms of anti-Semitic agitation. Recent German anti-Semitism, of which Hitler's victory is the fulfillment, has never worried itself overmuch to find scientific justification. It is one of the special characteristics of this movement that, from the very beginning, it has never proved anything, but always merely asserted. Its success depends on confusing and distracting people from the actual state of things. This anti-Semitism has always found expression in the most repulsive forms of incitement. During the Kapp Putsch early in 1920, the curious anti-Semitic symbol, the Hakenkreuz swastika, was first publicly exhibited on the steel helmets of the Erhardt Brigade. On that occasion, too, the Nazi songs were first publicly sung. Then also a real national man made speeches entirely composed of expressions such as Rathenau, the Jewish sow. On the streets the children were learning anti-Semitic songs. Now, in the Third Empire, they all know the glorious battle song whose refrain runs, quote, "When Jewish blood spurts from under the knife, things will be twice as good as before." End of quote. For 15 years, in tens of thousands of meetings and tens of thousands of articles in the press, the Jew has been presented by Hitler's party to the duped masses as the most utter abomination. The Jew is responsible for everything, for the war as well as the peace, for capitalism as well as the revolution, for poverty as well as wealth. The National Socialist agitation sees the Jew lurking everywhere and helping on the work of Judaism to reach its aim of world domination. And to Hitler and his followers this is equivalent to the destruction of the world. Here we can only give some examples of the absurdity and vileness of this anti-Semitism. Hitler on the Jews. We take these examples from the most official statement of National Socialism, Hitler's book My Fight, which is now circulating in many hundreds of thousands of copies. There we find, quote, "The black-haired Jewish youth lies in wait for hours, satanic joy in his face, for the unsuspecting girl, whom he defiles with his blood and thereby robs from her own race. They were and are Jews who brought Negroes to the Rhine, always with the same aim and idea in their minds of destroying, through the bastardization that must inevitably result, the white race which they hate, of bringing it down from its high cultural and political level, and themselves getting the mastery over it. In culture, the Jew defiles art, literature, and the theater, destroys natural sentiments, undermines all ideas of beauty and dignity, of nobility and goodness, and drags humanity down under the spell of his own base mode of life. If the Jews were alone on this world, they would smother themselves in dirt and filth just the same in their attempts to get advantages over each other and destroy each other, insofar as their complete lack of any sense of self-sacrifice, which finds expression in their cowardice, did not turn the fight into a farce. When the Jew wins political power, he casts aside the few wrappings which he still has. The democratic Jew of the people becomes the Jew of blood and tyranny. He tries in a few years to root out the national carriers of intelligence, and by robbing the peoples of their natural intellectual leadership, prepares them for their lot as slaves in permanent subjection." End of quote. It must be borne in mind that these phrases occur in a book which is certainly representative and was written with the consciousness that it was representative. The extracts given in fact illustrate only the mildest and most restrained form of anti-Semitic agitation. A different and much clearer language is used in meetings and in articles in the press. For years, the typical headlines in the National Socialist papers have been "At the udders of the Jewish sow," "The Jewish plague in the world," and so forth. And finally, it must not be forgotten that the main battle cry of the Hitler movement is "Perish Judah." In the Guide and Instructional Letter for Functionaries of the National Socialists, dated March 15, 1931, we find, quote, "The natural hostility of the peasant against the Jews, and his hostility against the Freemason as a servant of the Jew, must be worked up to a frenzy." Day of Reckoning. It is necessary to recall all this in order to realize the ridiculous character of the dementias issued by the National Socialist members of the government in connection with the reports of the persecution of Jews, and the grotesque nature of the statement that the Jews would suffer no harm under Adolf Hitler's protecting rule. For 15 years the Jews have been spoken of as a world plague, as the most brutish of sub-men, and the adherents of the National Socialist movement have been given license to calumniate and persecute the Jews. Hatred of the Jews has been systematically nurtured. For 15 years a day of reckoning has been promised. Is it strange that this sowing of murder should bear fruit when the so-called national revolution developed? Every young National Socialist has been ceaselessly told that it is a moral act, and his highest duty as a national German, to extirpate the Jews. How is it possible to make these young National Socialists understand that now, when they are in power, they are to protect the Jews? So they are given a free hand, and very willingly too, for of all the things which they have been promised, the only thing they can be given is the satisfaction of their lust for murder. The government cannot give all National Socialist supporters bread and work, nor can it improve the economic situation, or redeem any of the promises it made. But so long as it allows the lower middle class to persecute and beat up the Jews, it can distract them from the tremendous imposture of which they too have been the victims. For this reason, the campaign against the Jews is given its head in Hitler's Germany. It would be a terrible mistake to think that the persecution of the Jews was only a transitory phenomenon of the period when Hitler took power. It is a political measure systematically carried out, and necessary for the tremendous deception of the people. Minister Goebbels, in a pamphlet called the Nazi Sozi, says that, quote, "The liberation of the German nation can only be carried out against the Jews. It is true that the Jew is also a man, but the flea is also an animal, but not a pleasant one. Our duty to ourselves and to our conscience requires us to make him harmless." End of quote. Jews are watching you. To show that the anti-Semitic propaganda has not in any way stopped, but that it is being carried on in an organized way, making use of every available means, we quote only one of the publications which have appeared since Hitler took power. It is a book by Dr. Johann von Leers, with the title "Jews are Watching You." It is a somewhat random collection of photographs which are presented to the German people by way of a warning. Among some 60 photographs of Germans and people of other nationalities, there are pictures of Karl Liebknecht, who was a descendant of Martin Luther, of the Catholic leader Erzberger, of Willy Munzenberg, in whom there is not a drop of Jewish blood, of Grzinski, of the Catholic mayor of Cologne, Adenauer, of Erwin Piscator, son of a clergyman, who are all, on the National Socialist racial theory, Germans of pure race. But this is characteristic. In Hitler's Germany, no one takes the trouble to check up even the most simple facts which are supposed to be the basis of statements made. It is quite enough to make assertions and calumniations. Anyone who is inconvenient to the Hitler regime is a Jew, so far as this regime is concerned. That is all there is to it. The conception of responsibility is completely alien to these National Socialist writers. If anyone asks for any proof, the National Socialist storm troops are good enough to silence any inconvenient questioner. This is the reason why no one dares to challenge even the most nonsensical statements, and as no one contradicts them, the masses believe everything. This book, which we hope will get a very wide circulation, as it is really a revelation of the spirit of the new regime, contains also photographs of Rosa Luxemburg, Professor Einstein, Georg Bernhard, Leon Feuchtwanger, Theodor Wolff, Emil Ludwig, Max Reinhardt, Charlie Chaplin, Alfred Kerr, and the American banker Otto H. Kahn. No one who is not a National Socialist will find anything repulsive in these photographs. For the most part, they are splendid heads of clever and serious people of real intellectual standing. The only repulsive things about the photographs are the titles which Dr. von Leers has provided. Under Rosa Luxemburg is printed, "Executed," Levine, "Executed," Erzberger, "Executed at last." The young Germans who shot him were released from persecution after the National Revolution of 1933. For Einstein there is the laconic remark, "Unhanged." This is a favorite observation of the compiler of the book. He uses it for everyone who has not yet been murdered. For Reinhardt, "his second-rate and soulless art," etc. Chaplin is described as a little sprawling Jew, as boring as he is repulsive. It is said of Toller, "promptly locked up after Adolf Hitler's seizure of power." But not even this is true, as by that time Ernst Toller was already out of Germany. Erwin Piscator is called a Bolshevistic artistic Jew. The bankers Max Warburg and Dr. Karl Melchior are said to be extremely dangerous. Among these Jews there is a young man of the name of Schlesinger, who once in desperation carried out an attack on a train which cost many lives. Later on he was released on an amnesty. In the course of the trial it came out that Schlesinger was not a Jew but a German of pure race. Anti-Semitic propaganda made use of the name at the time, but subsequently had to drop its attacks when it was proved beyond question that this Schlesinger was "of pure race." But Dr. von Leers writes under his photograph, "Moved by greed and unconcealed race hatred, he caused the terrible railway accident at Lefford." But what does it matter? One lie more or less makes no difference to these people. Perish Judah. Herr Hanfstaengl, foreign press chief of the National Socialists, gave a semi-official interview on March 27, 1933, to the American representative of the semi-official Telegraph Union Press Service. In reply to the question, "Are the reports of alleged maltreatment of Jews true or false?" he said, "A few minutes ago, when I met the Chancellor at the Munich airport on his arrival from Berlin, he authorized me to tell you that these reports are one and all base lies." Hanfstaengl's answer to detailed questions about the persecution of Jews was, "The Berlin embassies of Sweden and Holland have investigated and have found that not a single Jew has been killed." 43 murdered. The list of Jews shot or beaten to death by the storm troops has been checked by us, and it shows a total of 43. These 43 are the cases in which the victims were murdered primarily because they were Jews, not because they were Marxists. These 43 authentic cases, which have been examined in every detail, represent only a small part, a fraction of the real number, which will undoubtedly come to light in the course of time, when it becomes possible to get more exact information on the actual incidents which have taken place in Hitler's Germany. These 43 names are selected from many hundreds of names. All cases which up to now it has been impossible to check satisfactorily are left out of account. We do not want to estimate or think, but to prove actual facts. A few detailed examples are taken from the mass of material before us. On the 18th of March 1933, a tragic doom claimed our dearly beloved and promising son, Sigebert Kindermann, baker's apprentice, who had just completed his 18th year. Moritz Kindermann, sign painter, and his wife, Franzekstrasse 5. Funeral, Sunday, March 26, 1933, 2 p.m., Weissensee. No visits of condolence by request. The Jewish apprentice Kindermann, whose tragic doom this inconspicuous notice announces, was attacked in 1932 by National Socialists because he was a member of the completely non-political Jewish sports society Bar Kokhba. In connection with this attack, a National Socialist was charged and convicted. In order to revenge this conviction, after Hitler's seizure of power, young Kindermann was dragged to the Nazi barracks in the Hedemannstrasse in Berlin and there literally beaten to death, his body being then thrown out into the street. A large Hakenkreuz was cut in his chest. An example from Kassel. Dr. O. M. of Kassel reports as follows, quote, "On Friday, March 17, 1933, bands of Nazis went all over the town of Kassel, dragging off members of the Jewish community whom for any reason they did not like, in order to bring them to trial. It should be noted that the victims were not persons who have been prominent in politics of any kind. The reason for their ill treatment was as a rule some petty spite on the part of the Nazi leaders. The following were particularly bad cases. Dr. Max Plaut, a lawyer, was dragged out of his office by a large gang of Nazis and taken away in a closed car which drove along the main street. As they drove along, he was forced to shout Heil Hitler by blows with rubber batons, and each time he shouted the Nazis roared with glee. Plaut was taken to the Nazi headquarters, where a so-called court-martial was held and sentenced him for alleged professional shortcomings to 200 blows with rubber batons. He was then taken down to a cellar and strapped to a bench for the sentence to be carried out. He was then most terribly mishandled for almost 2 hours. After some time Plaut fainted. Water was then thrown over him until he revived, and he was given some alcohol by so-called sisters. When he had come to himself, the mishandling was resumed. By the time the brutal punishment had been concluded, he had completely lost consciousness, and was left, covered with blood, lying in a corner. Plaut was then taken to his flat, where he died 10 days later. The doctors who were called to attend him, Dr. Scholl, a nerve specialist, and Professor Tonnesen, head doctor of the state hospital, found the most terrible injuries, including serious damage to the internal organs, especially kidneys and lungs. His back and legs gradually turned completely black. Plaut had to be kept on his bed in a permanent state of narcosis, as when he came to consciousness he screamed so terribly that he was heard in the street. After 10 days of this, he died. On another occasion, another lawyer, Herr Dahlberg, was most brutally treated in the same way as Plaut, and at the same place. It should be noted that some time previously he had had a conflict in court with a lawyer who is now in an official position. This dispute was brought up against him while he was being mishandled. There can be no doubt, therefore, that the tortures inflicted on Dahlberg were due to direct instructions from this high Prussian official, who had previously been in command of the Kassel National Socialists. Dahlberg was so badly injured that for some days the doctors were afraid that one leg would have to be amputated, but fortunately it was found possible to save it. Dahlberg is still severely affected by the results of his ill treatment. Another particularly bad case was that of a young Jewish merchant, Mosbach, against whom, so far as I know, the only accusation was that he had had relations with a Christian girl, though these had been discontinued. Nazis broke into his flat, and in the presence of his mother beat him so brutally that his head and spine were terribly injured. A doctor was called, Dr. Stefan, who is politically on the extreme right, and he stated that even during the war he had never seen such an appalling sight. For a long time Mosbach hovered between life and death, but his life was eventually saved. On the same day, also at Nazi headquarters, 2 merchants, Freudenstein and Ball, were beaten and severely injured, both of them being dangerously ill for some time after. In both cases the ill treatment was an act of personal revenge on the part of certain Nazis, but I have no details. There was also a case of a banker named Plaut being severely handled, but his injuries were not so severe. He was 60 years of age. The crimes of the Nazis in Hesse were certainly not restricted to Kassel. It would not be an exaggeration to say that in every village in the province of Kassel where any Jews live there have been similar cases, some of them appalling. I know that in some villages all the male members of the Jewish community have left their homes and only returned, if they have returned at all, after a long interval." End of quote. Forced to sign a statement. Leo Krell, 25 years of age, living in the Skalitzerstrasse, Berlin, was attacked by a Nazi storm detachment and carried off to a Nazi barracks, where he was murdered. His body was then dropped in front of the Jewish cemetery. We mention this case because of what followed. His aged mother received a letter asking her to go and identify her son in the mortuary. It was difficult for her to identify the body, which was mutilated in every way. The Hakenkreuz had been carved in his face and all over his body and burnt into the flesh. All that was left of her son was a mass of bleeding pulp. Faced with this mutilated body, the mother was compelled to sign a statement that her son had died, quote, after a long illness in hospital, end of quote. Such statements are always demanded from relatives in the case of people who have been beaten to death. If any of the relatives ever hint, even in private, at what actually happened, they can look forward to being brought before a court and sentenced to many months, if not years, of imprisonment for taking part in an atrocity campaign. As a rule, the storm detachment people concerned tell the relatives that they will suffer the same fate if they do not, quote, keep their mouths shut, end of quote. A deep silence lies over Germany. The people who are suffering dare not even call for help. That would be treason. 43 mutilated corpses of Jews who had been beaten to death with rubber batons, steel rods, and leather whips have been recorded up to now. People whose only crime was that they were Jews. We do not know the total number of such corpses that have been secretly buried. Perhaps 500, perhaps 1,000, perhaps even more. The future will bring it to light. It is only after some years that it will be realized that all the reports of the brutalities carried out by Hitler's bandits, which have so far been published, fall far short of the appalling reality. 300 proved cases of barbarous cruelty. 43 mutilated corpses, identified and authenticated up to the present. And how many cases of people beaten almost to death, or injured for life? Up to now, we have records of 301 cases of severe bodily injuries inflicted on Jews, cases in which we have been in a position to verify the place and date of the crime and the identity of the person injured. The actual number of Jews who have suffered ill usage must already be considerably over 10,000. Of the 300 cases which we have been able to verify, we give the following examples. In the middle of April, a number of papers reported that Rabbi Jonas Frankel, who was over 80, had been attacked and severely ill-treated by storm detachment men at his home in Berlin, Dragonerstrasse 37. The government issued a denial of this report. The rabbi's daughter, Ella Frankel, reports the following details. Quote, How My Father Was to be Murdered by Ella Frankel. At about 7:30 on the evening of March 7th, 3 storm troop auxiliary policemen forced their way into our flat at Dragonerstrasse 37. 2 of them held me prisoner, with their revolvers pointed at my forehead and my breast. The third shot at my father, who was sitting at his desk. 2 bullets struck his head, and my father, streaming with blood, sank unconscious to the floor. One of the Nazis shouted, "That's fixed him." Then they broke open the desk and stole all the money in it. My dowry of $5,000 and 2,000 marks. Before leaving, they warned me against calling for help and smashed the electricity connection so that the flat was left in darkness. We later ascertained that these auxiliary police were members of the Dragonerstrasse storm troops. I lifted my father from where he was by the desk to the window, and for half an hour was calling for help. The street was cordoned off by Nazis and several squads of police. Anyone who attempted to leave his house was driven back with blows from rubber batons. Eventually some police officers came up, followed by officials of the Humane Society, with whom our neighbors had gotten into touch. They wanted to take my father to hospital, but I would not agree. 2 days later we were visited by an official from the Polish consulate. He found the flat still splashed with blood. For 2 weeks my father lay helpless. We were afraid every hour that he was going to die. On April 8th, some Nazis again came to the flat and demanded to see my father. They stated that if my father was willing to certify in writing that he had not been attacked by Nazis but by Jews, he would not be interfered with again. I told them that my father was too ill to write and that they must come back again in 2 days' time. They drew their revolvers and forced both of us to give our words of honor that we would give them the certificate 2 days later. As my father was determined in no case to give such a declaration, the only course left to us was to get away as quickly as possible. Two friends wrapped him up in a rug and took him away in broad daylight to friends living in a distant part of the town. I was almost out of my mind with anxiety. We had previously taken away the two scrolls of the law. Footnote: a scroll of the law consists of two tables of stone, round which is wound a parchment on which the Pentateuch is inscribed. End of footnote. But we left everything else in the flat. I left the house in indoor clothes and without a hat, as our porter was a Nazi and he would immediately have denounced us. We took the train to Vienna. My father, whose head was covered with bandages, was represented as being very old and deaf. I said that I was traveling to Vienna and had promised to look after the old man on the way. Soon after the train left Berlin, a spy came and sat with us and put questions to me, but he left the compartment when we reached Dresden, as my answers had not made him suspicious. After Dresden, the examination of passengers began. German officials went from compartment to compartment asking, "Are you Jews?" I took up my position at the door of the compartment, in which there were only the two scrolls of the law besides my father. The officials had, however, already been given a report by the spy, and they greeted me politely and said, "Ah, you are the young lady traveling to Vienna and looking after the deaf old gentleman. We have this information already." So we succeeded in getting here, and stopped at Reichenberg, as my father was quite unable to travel any further then. Later we came on to Prague. My father is still lying here ill. End of quote. We have given this case in detail, as it is a very typical one, and we refer the reader to the accompanying photographs. A rabbi, 80 years of age, attacked and left for dead, and his flat robbed. But the dementi machine has the effrontery to announce to the press of the world that there was no such person as this rabbi. This case is typical of 1,000 dementis of a regime which lies with an unscrupulous brutality equal to that with which it murders. Attacked in the synagogue. We want to state another case, the scene of which was a synagogue. Rabbi Berish was in the synagogue in Duisburg at the divine service when he was attacked and brutally handled. He was dragged out through the street, and after being wrapped in the black, red, gold flag, was made to run the gauntlet through a crowd of shouting men. Finally he was arrested, and the charge made against him was being responsible for public disorder in the street. The rabbi of Gelsenkirchen was driven out of the synagogue during the Sabbath service, and with a number of other Jews was taken through the streets to the Nazi barracks. There they were all forced to turn their faces to the wall and make genuflections. When the rabbi protested against this, he was laid across a ladder and beaten with a stick. Later he was set free, and succeeded in escaping across the Dutch frontier. He arrived at Amsterdam so severely injured that he was unable to stand. Before the Nazis set him free, they forced him to sign a declaration that his imprisonment had been due to a misunderstanding. Pogroms. The Frankfurter Zeitung of April 24, 1933, contains the following announcement. Quote, Wiesbaden, April 23rd. 2 assaults with fatal results occurred here on Saturday evening. The 2 victims were a merchant, Salomon Rosenstrauch, and a dairyman, Max Kassel. The police report on the murder of Max Kassel runs as follows. On Saturday at 23:30, cries for help were heard coming from a flat in number 43 Webergasse. At the same time, a number of shots rang out. A motor lorry driver who was passing along the street went and informed the police. The police ascertained that the cries for help had come from the flat of Max Kassel, a dairyman, 59 years of age. On entering, the officers found Kassel lying dead on the floor of one of the rooms. On examination, the body showed bullet wounds which had proved fatal. Further investigation showed that several persons, by breaking in a door panel, had forced their way into the flat and shot the man as he was running towards the window. The shots had been fired from an army revolver. The investigations did not produce any evidence showing that the motive of the crime was robbery, and the indications are that it was an act of revenge. End of quote. The official report of the second case states that on that Saturday at 21:45, the police were called to the flat of a merchant, R., 58 years old, living in Wilhelmstrasse 20. R. was lying on the ground, only just breathing. The body showed no injuries. A doctor ordered the man to be taken to hospital, but he died on the way from heart failure. The housekeeper, who was still in the flat, stated that at 21:10, 2 young men had rung at the door of the flat and asked for R. When he came to the door, the 2 men pushed their way into the flat, and one of them pointed a revolver at R. R. fled into another room and fell to the ground. The two attackers then left the flat without giving any further explanation. According to the woman's description, they were two lads of between 20 and 23 years of age. We mention these cases because they seem to us typical of the actual pogrom which is being carried out. End of Chapter 8, Part 1.